Sarah Sassoon is an Australian-born Iraqi Jewish writer, poet, and educator who lives in Jerusalem. She is the author of the award-winning picture book for children, Shoham's Bangle, and more recently, This Is Not a Cholent. Her poetry micro-chapbook, This Is Why We Don't Look Back, was awarded the Harbour Review Jewish Women's Poetry Prize. Welcome to the JNS Jerusalem studio, Sarah Sassoon.
Thank you, Steve.
Tell us a little bit about your career.
Okay. I guess my career, you can start speaking about it by my aliyah to Jerusalem. I guess as a writer, I've always written and I've always taught. I lived in South Africa and I taught for the academy Ezra and Nehemiah, which is actually the books in the Bible that deal with Babylonian Jews. And when coming to Jerusalem, I found my writing groove and space with writing groups in children's stories and poetry. And from there, I actually found my voice, which is to tell the story of my grandparents as Iraqi Jews and travel where my family didn't speak. And so that's how I wrote Shoham's Bangle, which is all about a little girl who leaves Iraq and comes to Israel. And it's based on my family story.
So tell me a little bit about your family story.
So my family, all my grandparents are from Iraq. My father was born in Baghdad. And in 1951, they all had to leave and came to Israel. In the 60s, they moved to Australia, which is why I was born in Sydney, Australia. And growing up in Australia, I always was brought up with like a Middle Eastern home, food, music. But I wasn't really told about their lives in Iraq, and I wasn't told why they had to leave. And I wasn't told about their lives in Israel. So they spoke Hebrew, they spoke Judeo-Arabic, but they didn't speak to me in those languages. So in a sense, I grew up with the silence and of real immigrant parents in Australia. So it was a very different kind of childhood, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And what led you to becoming a writer, a poet?
Right. So I guess the child of immigrants, I loved reading. And that's how I actually learned to speak. I say many English words incorrectly because I read them in books rather than heard them at home, which is interesting. I think it's a real immigrant child experience. And so for me, books have always been a window into other worlds. And I always wanted to do that as well. And I loved words and I was good at English. And it just comes to me naturally.
But the main thrust of your writing is the fact that you come from an Iraqi Jewish culture.
Right.
And how does that affect what you convey to your readers, including many children?
Right. So the truth is that I did creative writing at Wits University, an honors program. And I was top of the class, but I never wrote about the main issues I was going through. I never wrote about being an Iraqi Jew. I didn't write about being a new mother. I was a mother of a 1-year-old at the time. I didn't write about what mattered. And as coming to Jerusalem and joining my groups, I wrote Ashkenazi stories. I wrote about my third grandfather who was from Czechoslovakia and went through the Holocaust and lost his wife and 5 children. Those stories were familiar to me. My own story wasn't. And then one day I wrote a poem about my grandparents, and my poetry group turned to me and said, that's what you need to write about. And as it was, I was obsessed with researching Baghdad, and I was reading books all the time. And I was the granddaughter who was calling my grandmother, asking for the recipes. Pesach's coming, I need date syrup. How do I make chalek? How do I make apple jam for Rosh Hashanah? Chalek's date syrup. I think I said that. So I was always trying to recreate where I came from in my own home as my boys were growing up because I missed it. I had married a South African, moved to South Africa. His family, funnily enough, was probably one of the very few Baghdadi families in Johannesburg. His grandfather was from Baghdad. And actually, when our grandfathers were speaking, they spoke in Judeo-Baghdadi to each other and discussed their principle they had in Baghdad. His grandfather left in 1923, though, a lot earlier than my grandfather did.
And now you live in Jerusalem with, you have 4 sons?
Yes, I live in Jerusalem with 4 sons.
At least one or two of them have served in the IDF.
Yes. So my oldest was in Sayeret Sanchanim for the 2 years of the war, and my second's now in Nachal.
And how has October 7th impacted you and your family and your writing?
Right. So October 7th, I think, was shocking for me because suddenly all the red flags I saw in my research about why the Jews left Iraq in 1951, when the 1950 was the Tuskegee Law, which allowed them to leave. Before, they weren't actually allowed to leave. They didn't have passports. And I didn't understand, why did they leave a place that my grandmother called the Garden of Eden? And I was researching that. I wanted to understand, what was life like for Jews in Baghdad, in Iraq? How did they live? And I found out that, for example, Baghdad in 1917, a third of the city was Jewish.
It's amazing.
So the majority, you were surrounded by Jews. The Jews built the new country of Iraq that was established after the Ottoman Empire fell. The British came in, and the Jews were the ones who were educated through the Alliance school system. And so they were the ones who were fit to serve in the telegraph offices, in the train stations, in the postal services. They really, there were 5 Jews in the parliament. I think 5. They were disproportionately represented. There weren't that many Jews in Iraq, just like there aren't so many Jews in many countries, yet they disproportionately represented the economy. On Shabbat, the shuk was closed. Everything was quiet in Baghdad because the Jews weren't working. So it was a different world completely, but why did they leave? And the reason was because in the education system in the 30s, the German propaganda was coming in. Pan-Arab nationalism was rising, and it was very carefully orchestrated. This Jew hate that was created that allowed for the 1941 Farhud, which was the massacre of the Jews, which was a huge, and now maybe I'm digressing a bit, but all this is connected to the question. It was a mob massacre which began in a mosque. It began Tzvi Yehuda describes it in his book on Babylonian Jews, and he says it began in a mosque, and it was incited from within, and it was planned. And it was the day that the British were coming, the day the region was coming back. The British had beaten the Iraqi army back, because what had happened in Iraq, there was a coup in 1941, which took over the British supporting governance, and was pan-Arab nationalist, German supporting. And what happened with that was that the Jews were in huge danger. So when the British beat the Iraqi army back, the Jews were happy. And so one of the reasons people say that the massacre happened was because the Jews had supported the regent. But really, it was a massacre of neighbor against Jew. But it was also, and something I've learned, I interview a lot of Iraqis, this old Iraqi woman said as well, for every Jew killed, and we have 179 names of Jews killed, and it was like October 7th, the rapes, the looting, that it was just complete, utter destruction in the houses of the Jews. That's what was so shocking. They came to the houses of the Jews. The houses were marked with red hands, and that's the reason, one of the things I've done since October 7th was speak out against the red hand. So you see, I learned all this before October 7th, and suddenly you have red hands on the lapels of Hollywood celebrities. And I'm looking at the red hand, and I'm looking at the Farhud and saying those red hands were on the doors of Jews so they'd know who to come massacre. But again, for every Jew killed, these women said they were Jews saved by their Muslim neighbors and Christian neighbors. So it's holding both. And that's something we've had to learn to do since October 7th as well. How do you hold both? How do you hold that there are Muslims who say they want to take over Israel and kill every Jew, as it's written in the Hamas Charter? And then how do you accept that there are Muslims who have no voice to speak against Hamas, for example, within Gaza, within Judea, Samaria? This week I got an Instagram message from a man in Judea, Samaria. Obviously, he couldn't tell me his name, but he said he used to work in Israel. He used to go to Tel Aviv, and he loves Israel. He can't speak up because it's too dangerous, but he wishes that only good for the Jews and Israel, and he's just sorry that he can't live in freedom in Israel. So that those voices are silenced, and so I guess that my research into that Jews lived in Iraq, they lived well. There were Muslims who went and killed them in the Farhud and made lives so miserable that they had to leave in 1951. But there were also Muslims who loved the Jews and would have wanted them to stay but could not speak up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the situation we're in now. And it's how do you hold both? And because of my research, I can hold both. And I believe there are many, many, many people in the Middle East and within Israel as well who support Israel and the Jews and look to Israel as a hope for the freedoms they wish and for the voices they want to have. And that's what drives my writing.
And you have a huge following on social media, including Instagram, as you mentioned. But your message there is essentially one of hope, and that people like you, who have origins in Arab countries, could actually provide the key to a bridge, if you like, to the future.
I think so. And I think it's simple. I feel like we live in a world of politics instead of people.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes politics take away our personal sense of power. Every person has the power to choose. And if every person chooses to see the world a little bit differently from the newspapers, to say what is right here, what is an act of love, what is an act of kindness, what is an act of light, or is this an act of hate? Is this a word of hate? Very basic and human. Is this an act that creates goodness in the world? And it sounds so simple and maybe naive, but really, if every person was able to do that, and we are strictly against anyone who harms the harmony. So we have to, on one hand, it's like the image from Nehemiah when they're building the walls of Jerusalem when they return. The people are building the walls and they're being threatened by the Samaritans who don't want the Judeans to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and be safe. So how do they build the walls? In one hand, they've got the hammer to build, and on the other hand, they have the sword. So on the one hand, we have to be very clear what we want to build. We want to build safe homes, safe societies based on coexistence and mutual respect, and a respect that comes from the home, from respecting that we protect our families. And on the other hand, we have the sword. Anyone who dares harm our protected space of what it is to live in a peaceful society, we have no mercy on you. You cannot come with your hatred. And we will not give you airspace. We will not give you time. We will have to, I mean, this is my 2 sons in the army. The Israeli army is to defend the country, and they're there to defend every person in Israel, Jew, Muslim, Druze, Christian, everybody here. It's their duty to defend Israelis. And it's not about religion. It's not about culture. It's about just basic humanity. And we just have to go back to basic humanity without politics. And that's why across the spectrum, you'll have extremists, but that doesn't mean that you wipe a whole culture or people out. But again, some societies have been taken over, and that's why education is so important to me as well. We need to insist that education teaches messages of growth, messages of building, not messages of hate and victimhood. It's something I don't relate to, especially from my background.
Do you think that the alliances that Israel has formed with some Arab countries, like in the Abraham Accords, and since October 7th as well, where countries have either aligned with, if you like, Israel and the, against the axis of Iran and the other countries that are so opposed to the Jewish state. Do you see any hope that perhaps one day Arab countries such as Iraq could be brought into the fold?
That is the hope. My Iraqi friends, I've got one very good Baghdadi friend. He works in a bank. He's got a wife and a daughter. And he's very into politics. He really knows what's going on. And his hope is the Abraham Accords. And I think many Iraqis hope for that. But as long as the Iranian regime reigns, Iraq is an Iranian proxy at the moment, and there's no chance. In Iraq at the moment, you can't even speak about the Tigris River drying up without being prosecuted. There's so much silencing. To speak to an Israeli like me it's the death penalty. I don't think we understand from our Western perspectives what it means to live in the Middle East, and we can't put our Western eyes on the Middle East. We need to enter the Middle East from a Middle Eastern perspective, from the Middle Eastern culture.
Mhm.
And we need to speak their language. And that is the language of family. Family is the most important thing in the Middle East. And we do everything to protect the family. And so the beautiful thing about the Abraham Accords and the way it's told, the narrative of it is we are the children of Abraham. And suddenly we're given a different mission. We are both the children of Abraham. What world do we want to live in together? And that's what I'm missing in what people speak about it in the politics, is where is the vision for what we want the Middle East to be?
Mhm.
It almost suits everyone for the Middle East to be on fire, but it does not suit the simple person on the street. It does not suit the people who reach out to me and share their stories and say that they love the work I do, because it gives them hope. It gives them a voice. It sees just the average, simple person. And if we're honest, the world is made up of average people, simple people who just want to provide for their families and have a good dinner with them.
And that's why your voice is so important. But let's go back a little bit to your writing as we approach the end of the interview. It's such a tantalizing title, but tell me a little bit about This Is Not Cholent.
So This Is Not a Challenge is just about my grandmother's to beat, which is the idea that a little girl grows up in Sydney and she enters a challenge competition, but she enters her grandmother's to beat, which is not a cholent. It's also cooked overnight on Shabbat. It's chicken and rice, and very, very different to what European Jews make for Shabbat. So everyone's telling her every step of the way, as she's cutting the onions and the tomatoes and the ginger and the garlic, they're saying, this is not a cholent. And her grandmother's there with her making it. And she says, don't worry. This is a special dish. There's traveled many hands and lands to be here. And that's what I really want to offer. That tradition is something we can be so proud of from wherever we come from. And it gives us roots, but also so that we can share it with others and create community around it, new community. And my grandmother had to do that, moving from Iraq, then to Israel, to the tent camps in Israel, where life was really, really difficult. And then in the 60s, moving to city with her 8 children. So she had quite a life, and yet she was always so positive and joyous. And that's what she taught me, to rather share what we have. And I hope that when I write from that space as well.
Absolutely. And you are, above all, a storyteller par excellence. And I'm wondering if that came from your family as well.
Yes, my grandfather was a storyteller. I'm learning. He actually did write a memoir later on in his life. And I come from a family of chachamim. My family name in Australia is Hakim, which comes from the word chacham, and that's the rabbis and the teachers. And stories is a big part of Middle Eastern culture. It's the stories we tell that are important and give us so much strength as well. So I've got another children's book coming out actually in Israel in Hebrew, and please God also in America.
Tell us about that.
So it's called Ha'ud B'Tizmoret, the Ud in the Orchestra, and it's all about the Al-Kuwaiti brothers. So they were the most famous musicians in Iraq. And the songs still sung in Iraq now are their songs, but they're called folk songs because when they left, they took away the Al-Kuwaiti brothers' names because they were Jewish. So their names were erased, but their songs live on.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all about their grandson. It's based on their grandson, Dudu Tassa. Kind of. It was inspired. It kind of fits their whole story. But basically, when they came to Israel, they didn't allow their children to play musical instruments because in Israel, the oud wasn't recognized as an acceptable instrument. It wasn't Mozart. It wasn't Beethoven. This was the European Jews came with their European music, and they heard Arabic music, and it didn't sound great to them, to their ears. So when their son wants to play the oud, when the grandson wants to play the oud, the grandfather's like, no, become an accountant, become something else, but not a musician, and especially don't play the oud. because no one wants to hear it. So the grandson goes on to prove that there is a place for the oud in the orchestra.
Amazing. And what made you write in Hebrew this time?
Because my stories are essentially such Middle Eastern stories that have to also be heard in Israel. My father and his siblings, they went through such a hard time when they came here.
Mm-hmm.
There was so much shame about coming from Arab countries that was put on them when really their culture was so rich and there's so much to be proud of. And I think my generation, as the second, third generation, are able to come and say, wait, we love the homes we grew up in. We want to share it.
Mm-hmm.
And my uncle in LA once came to a talk I gave about Shams Bengal. And he sat there and he said, for the first time, I'm proud of being an Iraqi Jew. I didn't know how much I had to be proud of. And he was born in Baghdad. He was 6 when he left. So he had so much to be proud of, and yet so much was taken away from them because they came here with nothing. Mm-hmm. They had lost everything. They lost, how do you put 2,600 years of Babylonian Jewish history in a tent camp? And that's really what I'm recovering as well. And that's why I also focus on the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is the second restoration. There's so much in those books that parallel to what's happening today. The same issues they had in biblical times we're having now. Issues of leadership, issues of who is a Jew, issues of how do we build a Jewish identity coming back as diaspora Jews into a new country? What is our mission and our role as Jews now in the world? Everything's changed. And that is what we need to address now, but with a lot of joy and hope. Because yes, the reality is grim. October 7th was grim. The last 2 years of the war, as a mother of a soldier, I know how hard it's been. And it's been devastating. And yet the flowers are growing. The almond blossoms are on the trees. We need to focus on the reality that there are good things happening. There are Middle Eastern people who want to believe in Israel, that Israel will come and spread the way Israel is, which is coexistence and acceptance, where women can walk on the street free and have agency. That means so much to people. And I think that's the mission of Israel now. And we should be so proud as Jews, as Israelis, because what we have accomplished in the Middle East is exactly why our enemies hate us. And that for what they hate us for, we should be the most proud. And we've got so much to offer as a society that really values family and the traditional values of the Middle East, but also that values freedoms that help create a society that will last much longer than what's happening in the Middle East, than being on fire. We know how to live in peace.
Sarah Sassoon, it was really an honor and a pleasure to interview you, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thank you.